Lecture number 9, we're going to focus here more so on carbon dioxide and how it is transported through the blood and released to the air. Okay, so CO2 is not transported in the same way as oxygen gas is. CO2, we saw how oxygen gas, some of it is actually just dissolved in the plasma, the liquid portion of the blood, but most of it attaches to hemoglobin, attaches to those irons in the hemoglobin molecules, and that's how it's actually transported through the blood. CO2 is transported actually in 3 forms. About 7 to 10% of it is actually dissolved in the plasma, so your blood plasma is carbonated, kind of like a Coke is. 20% of it does bond to hemoglobin, okay, but it actually bonds to the globin portion. So again, hemoglobin is built from, I made that squiggly a little bit too big, but 4 proteins, and then each of those proteins has a heme in the center, and then each heme has an iron in the center of it, and the irons, that's where the O2 attaches. About 20% of the CO2 that gets transported in blood attaches to the protein portions of hemoglobin. Those are called the globin proteins. When hemoglobin has CO2 bonded to it, it's called carbaminohemoglobin. So carbamino is referring to the bonding between CO2, and amino is referring to amino acids. Those are the building blocks of proteins. So that's where that name came from. About 70% of it, though, is transported in the form of bicarbonate ions. And a bicarbonate ion, as you see there, is a hydrogen, a carbon, and 3 oxygen atoms bonded together to form a molecule. And that molecule has a negative charge. And so this is dissolved in your blood plasma, and your CO2s are actually part of that molecule, and we're going to see how all that works in a second. But this is called a bicarb ion or a bicarbonate ion, and you want to start learning that because when you work with patients, one of the things that can wind up getting measured in a patient when you're trying to figure out what's going on with them, they might be experiencing some pH problems with their body fluids. Bicarb levels are measured often to try to help the healthcare workers figure out what's going on. Well, where does this bicarbonate come from? Bicarbonate is a very important ion in your body fluids. Okay, so I was telling you to just start thinking about carbon dioxide functioning as an acid in your fluids, because the more CO2 around you have, the lower the pH of a body fluid will be. The reason for that is because here's CO2. Most CO2 molecules in your body fluids react very easily with water. So they bond with water. If you take a CO2 and an H2O and you bond those two together, you end up with this, H2CO3. That's called carbonic acid. Acids, if you think back to the very beginning of Biology 201 or an introductory biology class or a chemistry class, acids are molecules that break apart easily. Well, not necessarily easily, but they break apart and release hydrogen ions into the fluid, and then some other part, whatever is left over of the acid, and usually that's going to have a negative charge. Okay, so again, anytime you have an acid that breaks apart easily in a body fluid and releases these hydrogen ions, remember we were talking about in the last lecture, the more hydrogen ions you have around, the lower your pH. pH is a measurement of the hydrogen ion concentrations in a fluid. And I know it's difficult to remember, but you just have to remember that A lower pH value means you have more hydrogen ions around. A higher pH value means you have fewer of those around. And hydrogen ions are very chemically reactive. And you have to maintain just the right concentrations of those. That's why pH homeostasis is so important. If you have too many of them around, your important biological molecules have too many of these hydrogen ions attached to them, and they lose their three-dimensional shapes and they don't function properly. And also, if you have too few of them around, you don't have enough hydrogen ions attached to your important biological molecules, and they lose their proper 3D shapes and they don't function properly either. So it's you have a very narrow window of proper concentration of those hydrogen ions. And again, those are measured by pH, so that's why, you know, our pH is supposed to stay between 7.35 and 7.45. We don't have a lot of wiggle room with that. Okay, so when this carbonic acid over here breaks apart, it releases a hydrogen ion, and then the other part of the molecule that's left is HCO3 with a negative charge, and that is what we call a bicarbonate ion. And I want you to notice something on this equation. You know, usually we're used to thinking about chemical reactions. I'm sorry, A plus B gives us AB bonded together, and we're done. You know, things like that. Or AB breaks apart into A plus B, and we're done. That's the usual way we think about chemical reactions. But a lot of chemical reactions in the body actually operate in a back and forth manner, and that's called equilibrium. And so that's kind of hard to get used to thinking about at first. But if you notice, you have these back and forth arrows here. That means that these chemical reactions you see here can actually proceed in both directions depending on the needs at that particular location. So CO2 plus water can bond to form carbonic acid, which will break apart into a hydrogen ion and bicarbonate. And then the reverse can also happen. This plus this can be bonded together to form carbonic acid, and carbonic acid can break apart into CO2 and water. So these types of reactions can go in both directions. They are reversible. And CO2 and water will combine on their own pretty well to form carbonic acid, but we actually have enzymes in our red blood cells called carbonic anhydrase enzymes. And those enzymes do this chemical reaction. That's their job. So enzymes are things that speed up chemical reactions and make them more likely to happen. That's why they're so critical. And so in this case, these carbonic anhydrase enzymes in our red blood cells force this chemical reaction to take place. So let's see this in action and see why this is important. Now this diagram is showing both oxygen release and carbon dioxide pickup in tissues. So let's look down here at the bottom. So here we've got, this is the blood, and this is a tissue over here. And this little grouping of cells you see here, that's the wall of your capillary. Okay, so you got a red blood cell. I notice in here we've got HbO2. That means you've got hemoglobin that's oxygenated. You have O2 on it, and O2 diffuses, comes off of the hemoglobin, moves across the capillary wall into these interstitial fluids and into your tissue cells. That happens due to diffusion, and they're also showing it down here. Some of your O2 you just have dissolved in your plasma, and that's going to diffuse out of the capillaries and into the surrounding tissues as well. With CO2, you have these different mechanisms for transporting CO2 out of your tissues and into the blood. So like they're showing you here, some of it diffuses out of the tissues and into the blood and dissolves in the plasma. Some of it just on its own reacts with water, becomes carbonic acid, and then breaks apart into bicarbonate a bicarbonate ion and hydrogen ions. So again, the CO2 is inside that molecule. Okay? Because it reacted with water to form this, and then the hydrogen ion came off, but the CO2 is part of that molecule now. That's how it's being transported in the blood. And then down here, some of it attaches to hemoglobin and becomes carbaminohemoglobin, and that's how it winds up getting transported. And then some of it reacts with water, quite a bit of it reacts with water, and this enzyme in red blood cells, carbonic anhydrase, deliberately forces this chemical reaction to take place. Notice they've got up here slow. That's because that's the reaction happening on its own. Fast, in red blood cells, the CO2 that enters those red blood cells, you have those carbonic anhydrase enzymes that force the chemical reaction to happen very, very, very quickly. Okay, now what about when we get to the lungs? Okay, so we're now in a pulmonary. This is a pulmonary. We've got a pulmonary capillary here and an alveolus over here. So O2, it's pretty straightforward. You have a greater concentration, higher partial pressure of O2 in the air spaces of the lungs. So that's going to diffuse into the red blood cells, and it's going to attach to hemoglobin. Some of the O2 diffuses into the blood and just dissolves in the plasma fluid. So just like we were talking about on the last video lecture. With CO2, so CO2 is moving out of the pulmonary capillary and over here into the alveolus. So the CO2 that's dissolved in the plasma, some of it's just going to diffuse over here into the alveolus. You have these bicarbonate ions in your body fluids. You have hydrogen ions floating around in your body fluids at all times. And so that chemical reaction we talked about seesaws back and forth. It can go in both directions. So over here in the pulmonary capillaries, because you have high CO2, and a lot of that CO2 is present inside these bicarbonate ions, there are a lot of those around that can react with hydrogen ions, and that tends to force the chemical reaction to go in that direction. It tends to force it to go in the opposite direction from what we talked about before. So bicarbonate ions and hydrogen ions will bond together temporarily to form carbonic acid, and that will break apart into H2O and CO2, and these CO2s can then diffuse over here into the air inside the alveoli. That's the slow version, but remember this enzyme carbonic anhydrase that we have in our red blood cells can force this to happen more quickly. And so bicarbonate inside those red blood cells, and it's actually deliberately transported in there. That's what they're showing you there on that part of the diagram. Don't worry about the chloride shift. We're not going to get into that particular topic. But bicarb inside red blood cells, hydrogen ions inside red blood cells. This enzyme forces them very quickly to combine into carbonic acid and then quickly causes them to break apart, and then that CO2 can diffuse across the respiratory membrane. Remember, this is your respiratory membrane right here, and into the air inside the alveoli. Then you also have some CO2 attached to the hemoglobin, the protein portions of the hemoglobin molecules, the carbaminohemoglobin, and those CO2s can dissociate from the hemoglobin and diffuse over into the air spaces of the lungs. So that's just showing you the different ways that happens. CO2 has a huge influence on blood pH, and you know what, I'm going to change that to blood and body fluid. Let's just change this to body fluid pH, because I want you guys to remember your body fluids move from compartment to compartment. So if you have a lower pH in your blood, you're going to have a lower pH in your body fluids, and vice versa, because these fluids move back and forth between compartments, and so do little bitty solutes like hydrogen ions that determine your pH. Okay, so CO2 levels help control your pH, and this is largely because, now there are other things that help control pH homeostasis in the body as well, but the amount of bicarbonate ions, the amount of CO2 plays a big role in dictating how this happens. It's because of this reversible chemical reaction that takes place. All right, so let's think about this. Let's say the pH of your body fluids is dropping. They're becoming acidic. What does that mean about our hydrogen ion concentration? That means we have a higher hydrogen ion concentration. Well, if you have more of these around, they're going to find these bicarbonate ions, and it's going to tend to push this chemical reaction in this direction. Okay, so excess hydrogen ions in your body fluids will bond with bicarbonate ions and become carbonic acid, and then they'll break apart going in this direction and become water and carbon dioxide. Now, what has happened to your hydrogen ion concentration when that occurs? That's going to cause your hydrogen ion concentration to go down, okay, because the hydrogen ions got soaked up by these bicarbonate ions and got converted over into CO2 and water. So that this is called a buffering system because it helps buffer or control your pH, helps keep it, maintain it within the normal homeostatic ranges. Now let's think about the opposite. Suppose your hydrogen ion concentration begins to drop, okay? So hydrogen ion concentration is down. What does that mean about our pH? pH is actually higher if hydrogen ion concentrations are lower. So if this is low, we need to maintain the proper concentration of those hydrogen ions in our body fluids. So how can we get more of them? We can run this equation in this way. We need to take CO2 and bond it to water and form carbonic acid and allow that carbonic acid to break apart into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions. So that will, in effect, increase your hydrogen ion concentration and lower your pH. So that can help bring your pH. Let's say the pH of your body fluids was over 7.45, and we need to bring it back down to between 7.35 and 7.45. One of the ways that your body can do that is to increase CO2 levels so that you have more CO2 around to react with water and force this chemical reaction to happen in that direction. Now, let's say your pH is too low. It's supposed to be 7.35 to 7.45. Let's say it's 7.25, which would be extremely low. That means you have too many of these around. So you need to bond those with bicarbonates and force this chemical reaction to head in that direction. And what's being generated there? CO2. And then we need to get rid of that CO2 as part of helping to control our pH. So if you lower those, what's that going to do to your pH? Fewer hydrogen ions around will increase your pH. So that's going to help bring your pH back into the normal homeostatic range. Okay, so how do we control these CO2 levels? So looking at that equation over there, we're talking about pH homeostasis and trying to help us maintain body fluid pH and hydrogen ion levels. Well, how do we control these CO2 levels? Because obviously they're going to play a big role in pH homeostasis. Interestingly, one of the main ways that your body controls your body fluid pH is through adjusting the respiratory rate. So let's think about it. If you have a slow, shallow breathing going on, what's going to happen to your CO2 levels in your body fluids? CO2 levels are going to go up. All right, so if we're thinking about this equation over here, if you have lots of CO2 around, the left side is getting heavy over there, it tends to force this reaction to happen in that direction. Okay, so higher levels of CO2 will end up leading to higher levels of this plus this, okay? And more hydrogen ions lowers the pH. Okay, so if you're experiencing slow, shallow breathing, that's going to cause your pH to drop. Now that might be happening deliberately to help you control your pH, or you might slow down your breathing rate to help lower your pH back into the normal homeostatic range. But if you have slow, shallow breathing for the wrong reasons, like due to some disorder or an injury, one of the consequences of that is your body fluid pH can drop too low. It can drop below the homeostatic range, which can lead to death if it's not treated. On the flip side, rapid breathing can cause an excessive loss of CO2. So if we go back and look at our chemical equation over here, if you exhale out too much, too much CO2, that means your CO2 levels are too low. And if you have too little CO2, remember we said if you have excess CO2, it tends to drive that reaction in that direction. Too little CO2 tends to force the chemical reaction in that direction. Okay? And if the reaction is happening in that direction, you're going to use up hydrogen ions. So your hydrogen ion concentration will drop. If you put brackets around something like an ion, that refers to concentration. So concentration of the hydrogen ions will drop and pH value will go up if you have a lower concentration of those. So if somebody is breathing really deeply, rapid breathing, that can cause excessive loss of CO2. You're blowing off too much CO2, and that can cause the pH of your body fluids to go up. Think about hyperventilation. What's going on in hyperventilation? You're breathing too fast. So why is that a problem? You might think, well, that shouldn't be a problem because I'm just taking in extra oxygen gas. But why does that make you feel so bad? And it can actually cause you to pass out if it continues for too long a period of time. The problem is not taking in too much oxygen gas. The problem is this: when you hyperventilate, ventilation is another term for breathing, you're exhaling out too much CO2, and that causes your pH of your body fluids to go up. CO2 level, maintaining proper CO2 levels in your body fluids is extremely important to your pH homeostasis. The easiest way to think about it is think of CO2 as an acid. Okay, this is the easy way to think about it. Okay, so too much CO2 equals too much acid. Because that CO2 is going to react with water and form carbonic acid. What's that going to do to your pH? It's going to lower your pH. Too little CO2 is too little acid. Now what's that going to do? Too little acid is going to raise your pH. So that's usually the best trick to use for thinking about the influence of carbon dioxide levels on the pH of your blood and your body fluids. So therefore, like we were talking about, if you exhale out too much CO2, you don't have enough CO2 in your body fluids. What's happening to your body fluid pH? It's going up. If you're not breathing, you're not ventilating enough, you're allowing too much CO2 to accumulate in your body fluids. That's too much acid in your body fluids. Your pH is going to go down. All right, that's going to bring us into control of respiration, which is very important for making sure you're taking in enough oxygen gas to supply all of your tissues. But as we've just been talking about, uh, another major function of your respiratory system is helping control the pH of your body fluids because CO2 plays such an important role in controlling that. So in lecture number 10, we're going to talk about how respiration is controlled, and some of this is going to be very similar to what we learned about as far as control of the cardiovascular system back in Unit 3. But that's where we'll pick up for lecture number 10.